David Crimmins, you are very welcome to the Lead Well podcast.
Thanks very much, Mark. Great to be here, and have to start by saying it's great to see the journey because we know each other for quite a long time. And you know, when I first knew you, it was up in Alsa in a personal trainer capacity, and you've done amazing in the last, I don't know how many years ago that was, but whatever it is, it's a long time. So well done.
I really appreciate that, and yeah, I think I was maybe 18, 19 at the time. Jeez. And 34 now, 35 this year. So it's a long-term relationship. Yeah. What's been really nice, and this obviously was leading into our conversation today, I wanted to reach out to you on LinkedIn and ask you to obviously come on the podcast. And I looked back at my last message to you, and it was, I think...
I blocked you, had I?
I think it was actually back in 2015, 2016. And we'd met at an event.
Yeah.
And you were working in GloHealth around that time.
Yeah.
And I'd asked you essentially, could you kind of give me an introduction to the wellbeing team? And I think it's a nice message to actually start this podcast with, because I think one thing we do forget is, you know, at that time, my business was in its second year. We were very much in our infancy. That introduction that you gave to me into the wellbeing team in GloHealth, which obviously subsequently went to Irish Life Health in time.
Yeah.
That's actually led for us to a 9-10 year relationship, which is still ongoing with Irish Life. But that all came from you giving us that initial introduction. And I think this idea of paying it forward, you know, it's just so important, especially for this community. So again, big thank you for that initial introduction into the GloHealth team.
My pleasure. Although I do remember actually, you were my personal trainer, then you went to Australia.
Yeah.
And then you remember when you came back, and I said, I had this idea to set up a gym. And remember I asked you, would you be interested? And you were like, no. And then here you are. So why I paid you forward is still, you know, I'm not sure. But we had a great person in GloHealth, Jacinta. She was probably one of the first, if not the first, in health insurance person dedicated to health and well-being, because we were heavily focused in GloHealth on particularly foreign direct investment, and within that primarily actually the US foreign direct investment, because we could see what was happening in, say, California with all the tech companies and what they were doing and putting into health and wellness, and therefore we wanted to offer that when they were setting up in Ireland, or if they were already set up in Ireland. And other companies had been doing health and wellness, but it was maybe, you know, someone in marketing, and it was part that they were doing health and wellness one day and then they were doing an ad the next day or whatever. Whereas Jacinta was a dedicated health and wellness manager, and you know, we probably won businesses as in sort of US foreign direct investment on some of the stuff that she did, along with other people as well, because it really set us apart that, you know, we had a dedicated program that we would fund effectively out of the premium income we were getting. So there was no additional charge to them. And it was exciting times in GloHealth. We were trying to shake things up a lot. And I think we succeeded. You know, Irish Life, as you said, bought us out. And then in the last month or so, all the people pretty much who set up GloHealth are back on the really merry-go-round again. Jim and Stephen and Ruth, etc. Level Health,
And it's funny you mentioned Jacinta, because I would actually always say, for me, she was a real integral part in the early years of my own business. And the reason for that was she never looked at the fact we were 2 years in business. I was quite young at the time. She never really looked at that. She looked at, okay, you know, how can you contribute to what we're trying to do here? We're trying to win the Facebooks. We're trying to win these big, massive multinationals. And how can you add value to what I'm essentially going in to sell? And for me, that was invaluable. Now, she held me to such a high standard, but we're still friends today. We actually did a little bit around strategy because she's obviously no longer in the kind of health insurance space. But I always say, everybody needs a Jacinta in their early years of their business. A lot of time for Jacinta. When you think of that time in GloHealth, David, because obviously we're going to dig into your career as a whole today and how that shaped you as a leader. When you think of GloHealth, obviously you were the chief commercial officer in there looking after sales and marketing. It was a challenger brand. How did that experience, I suppose, shape what was to come for you then stepping into CEO roles?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I joined about, I think, maybe 4 months after they had actually launched. So I wasn't involved initially in the sort of, I think they used to meet in a McDonald's or somewhere like that, when they were kind of sketching out what they were going to do. But I joined pretty quickly once they kind of gone public into the market. And it was, at one level, it was a relatively small, kind of very flat organization, but it was still, if you add in the call center and stuff, there was probably maybe 120, 130 people in one shape or another in that. But my kind of core team was about 8 people. And then underneath that, there was maybe another 30, 40 between call center and stuff. But those 8 people were, to a man and woman, were just amazing, first of all, to work with. So I was very fortunate in the team I inherited, and I had great people in marketing, in sales. We kind of split sales between B2C, B2B, and digital. And so that really helped me, because I had come out of a previous industry. I'd worked in financial services maybe 5-6 years earlier. And when I got in there, those first couple of months when I'm finding my feet, like, part of my real role was, not to get in the way of these people, because they were all brilliant at their jobs anyway. And I remember I went on holidays in the August. I think I joined in, say, February or something like that. And I went on holidays in the August, and I was kind of lying, sunning myself or whatever. And that was the first time I remember being able to think of myself and go, right, this is where I think, now I can look to take the brand, for example, etc. Whereas up until that point, I was really learning the business, building up the relationships with my team, and obviously with my peers, and ultimately with Jim, who was CEO, and Stephen, who was effectively almost like a co-CEO. And then from that point forward, I'd like to think then, there was a lot of stuff that I was able to bring to the table. But that initial team, so that really taught me the importance of, surrounding yourself with genuinely people who are much smarter than you. I mean, my background originally had been marketing, but it had been a long time since I had actually put a marketing campaign together. And in those intervening years, sort of digital had really come to the fore. So I would never have put a Google ad campaign together when I was sort of running marketing. I was a marketing manager. So having all those people there was great. And then in my peer group, so in the senior leadership team or senior management team, S&T we called it, there was, I think, a lot of what I found at a lot of companies I've worked at, I suppose, in one shape or another, there's a lot of big personalities, when you're at that sort of senior table, and getting to work in tandem sometimes can be difficult, because you're under a lot of pressure. And, if things are going great, well, it's brilliant. But if things aren't going great, it's very easy for ops to blame sales to blame bops. I don't know, we're all blaming finance because they didn't give us the budget, So, and I know that it took a while. There was one particular person, Jackie, who was the operations director. It's probably fair to say, we were kind of, red corner was Jackie, blue corner was David for the first maybe year of that company. But then one day we just realized, actually, what, if we sort of sat down out of the white heat of the sort of SMT meetings and started working together, we could actually, get rid of a lot of the, problems that we had. And some of them were kind of teething because it was a new company, etc. And that was also a really big learning again, where, putting on sort of the GloHealth jersey rather than the sales jersey or the marketing jersey. And as you go further up that food chain, you kind of have to leave a lot of the stuff that maybe got you to there in the first place behind, because you're no longer, you start off at the most junior level, and, as you're sort of, if you're the marketing manager like Amy was, and she was amazing, I want Amy focused on marketing. I don't want her focused on, ops or whatever. But when you're at the senior leadership team, you have to take that broader perspective. So I think that was also a big learning from that. And then Jim, who was CEO, Jim, we just said he's set it up again in Level Health, but he had actually done it before GloHealth even. So I think, Level will be number 3 on the list. So he obviously had a very strong understanding of the health insurance market, like phenomenally in-depth knowledge. But he was very focused on, data and detail. And when you went to those Tuesday morning meetings, you want to know your stuff. There was no room for kind of bluffing, despite my best efforts. So kind of learned, and he held you to account, and you needed to have your paper in the day before with, so he had a pre-read, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a lot of kind of, we'll call it habits that were tough to sometimes be on the other end of it. But probably if I'm looking at me now, then I will expect the guys coming into my meeting, when I was CEO, saying, "Where's your pre-read? Where's your thing?" And I morph into a little bit, not Jim, not as good as him, but in the sense of holding people to account. So I think they were the things I learned. The team around me, the people who were my peers, I worked with, and how to engage with them, and obviously then managing up.
Yeah, and actually, what's really standing out to me as you're speaking there, because I see a lot of smaller organizations as they grow to larger organizations face this problem. So you described it really well there, where if you think about culture and how it's created, generally when a business starts out, you've got the Jim, right?
Yeah.
And Jim has maybe a small amount of people that he's able to influence because he's got a lot of touch points with them. And then the company grows to a bigger size and Jim is not as readily available as he was previously. So then it's up to other people then to kind of muck in with one another and try and really keep that culture and that standard alive. But unfortunately, in the early years, what can happen is what you described. People butt heads a little bit. People put on the sales jersey or the ops jersey versus actually the GloHealth jersey. And in your experience of working in a number of organizations where they've gone from smaller teams to larger organizations of upwards and over 100 people, how have you found, I suppose, the best ways that you can speed up? Like you said, it took you a year to kind of both put on the GloHealth jersey. Have you figured out, based on your experience, how companies can speed up that process of really, I suppose, let's say, not having that conflict, but actually having that collaboration earlier on in the process?
Well, I suppose part of the delay in that sort of year was probably just my inexperience or naivety going in, and kind of the roles that I had come from. In particular, the role before that, I was in the startup, and I was kind of that person like the Jim who did, I was the CEO and the bottle washer and whatever else in between kind of type thing. So, I'd like to think that if subsequent to GloHealth, it wouldn't be a year, it'd be a week or a day that I'd sit down with, that person, the equivalent to Jackie, and say, right, I'm David, this is what I've got to do. Let's understand how we can work together, et cetera, et cetera. So I think part of that was, maybe, as I said, my inexperience, et cetera, and also the pressure you're under. I had to learn a lot about the industry, the team, et cetera. So maybe I was kind of a little bit blinkered in terms of what I'm going to really focus on, what I'm going to be judged on, what's my, personal objectives that Jim has set for me. And it's not really my business stepping into Jackie's domain. It's up to her to make sure she's hitting her objectives. But then the penny dropped to, well, actually her objectives and my objectives they're in sync, effectively. And so helping her is helping me. So I think the first one, how can I do it differently? And I think maybe as I went into places like WebDoctor, et cetera, I think I would have tried to do that much earlier just from learning that first time around. And look, that's what all life is like. It's a journey, and you start, you have to start at some point, and each time you're hopefully learning a bit more. But then there are other things to do. I mean, there was an interesting period. It was still within GloHealth, but GloHealth was purchased by Irish Life. And at the exact same time they purchased GloHealth, they had owned 49% from the get-go. And so they were buying out to 51. They didn't own. They also bought Aviva Health. But there was an interesting sort of dynamic, which was that Jim and Stephen and Ruth and Jackie and basically everyone who had come from GloHealth had originally been in Aviva Health at some point, and then had left Aviva to join, to set up GloHealth. And then all of a sudden, those two companies were basically stuck back together to become Irish Life Health. And, I always felt like it's one thing if you're working in sort of, say, the tech team and you're coding. I mean, you're not really thinking about the guy in Aviva Health who's doing the equivalent job as you. But on particularly the corporate sales team, we were going out pitching for, you mentioned Facebook or LinkedIn or Airbnb or whatever it was, and they'd have a beauty parade and sort of you're waiting to go into the boardroom, and coming out of the boardroom is there the Aviva Health guys. So it's very in your face. You know exactly who you're up against, et cetera, and you're trying to beat them in terms of win the business. So it was a very competitive space, and also with Lay and VHI as well. There was 4 companies at that time. So gelling the Aviva Health and the GloHealth corporate sales teams was potentially going to be a bit of a challenge. But so I suppose I had been on a journey, with GloHealth for about 3 years up to that point. And then we brought the two teams together, and they were sort of all reporting into me. And like, first thing I'd say is the guys who come in from Aviva, they were just absolutely brilliant, top notch. And, Lisa and a few others, they, made me very welcome. But there was still an Aviva mindset, and there was still a GloHealth mindset. So even though they were professional and they were nice, it was like, how do we get, those two mindsets now to become an Irish Life health mindset? And so what year was that? It was probably about 2016 or 17, something like that. I think it was 2016. So I have 3 boys, and, the two older lads were probably 12 and 11, and they were mad into Nerf guns at the time. So we were doing this away day. It was in down at the back of the island called the Jam Factory, or can't remember anyway, but it was a really cool sort of, a bit like, this place. It was kind of originally an industrial factory, but they sort of kept the industrial sort of paraphernalia, which we're doing in this room. And so I told anyone who had kids of similar age to mine, everyone's to bring a Nerf gun. And so what we did was I pinned up on the wall, and they were coming in. These were the rules. And rule number 1 was you could not say, well, in Aviva, this is what we used to do, or in GloHealth, this is what we did. And if you did say that, you could be shot by a Nerf gun. And we ended up having just an absolutely brilliant day. We brought in a speaker, Mary Parr, an Irish Olympian, and she spoke as well. And anytime I'd still see all those lads, one of the guys for my sins, a season ticket holder with at Old Trafford, we all still remember that day, and it just completely broke the ice, and was, I don't think I'd do it in every situation to bring in Nerf guns or anything like that. Yeah. But for whatever reason, I think we were all of a relatively similar age, and we probably had kids of a similar age, and therefore we were all used to that at home. And, and so that was, so sometimes you just have to think, how can I short circuit it in a way that is engaging, is fun, is going to be memorable. But there was a serious thing, like we were shooting that mindset. That's what we were trying to do. We were killing that mindset in a way that, no animals were harmed in the production of it. But at the same time, so it wasn't just kind of a trite kind of fun game to do, just to sort of, there was
a meaning behind it.
It was a
desired outcome.
Yeah.
And I think it's great what you're describing, because I think what happens in that transition, whether it's two companies coming together in a merger, or whether it's a company going from a small organization to a larger organization, it then becomes critically important that the stuff that we're describing becomes ever present, becomes something that you do on a regular basis. It doesn't have to be every day or every week, but there is maybe that quarterly get together where you're trying to reinforce this idea that we are essentially one identity now. We have an overall goal as an organization. And whether you are in marketing or sales, or you're in the tech team, essentially, the more that we speak with one another, collaborate with one another, the better it's going to be for the wider organization. So we're not essentially on different teams here. You're on the one team. And I think that's very hard for it to happen just organically. I think we have to have a strategy around that. And we see that with most organizations. They have a really in-depth people strategy now. How are we going to get these guys essentially to collaborate? Because we know it's going to lead to better outcomes for the organization.
Yeah. I was in ResMed, which is a massive company. It's in the respiratory space, primarily in sleep apnea. And my role was based in Europe, and I was kind of going to all the different countries. But basically what my role was kind of to interpret the strategy that had been agreed in head office in San Diego, and how could that be sort of rolled out across 27 countries in Europe, but not kind of purely top down, but also bottom up, because my job was to influence back in San Diego. Well, in Germany it's different, blah, blah, blah. But one of the things that I did was I got cups made with a picture of a cow on it, and a big sort of circle around it, red circle with an X. And I sent it to, now they weren't my team, as in they didn't report to me, but I was on the same team as them. And they said, what's the story with the cow? And I said, well, I think fundamentally our job is to kill all the sacred cows, because there were loads of these sacred cows that were there. And I said, initially what we should be doing is kicking them, because sometimes sacred cows are there for a good reason, and you kick it and like it's robust, and there's a reason why we've always done it this way. Yeah, actually, so it's not change for change's sake. But sometimes you kick the cow and it falls over pretty easily, and you realize, actually, do you know what? that really is just whatever it is, a work practice or something that had developed over the years that didn't really make sense, either then probably, but certainly not now. And I think that's part of it. It's getting rid of these silos. And so what I noticed, because I knew nothing about sleep apnea. It's kind of a common theme here. I knew nothing about health insurance, knew nothing about sleep apnea. I'd never even heard of it before I did the interview. But I would go to the country manager in Italy and I'd get great feedback from them. And then I go to the country manager in, Spain, and they had the exact same problem. But the Italian manager had the problem and had solved it. But
speaking about one another.
And it wasn't their fault. It was just the structures of they were kind of siloed in their countries. And I know in Resmed that's changed a lot now. They've done some major reorganizational changes. But for someone who hardly knew what sleep apnea was and was only in the company a wet weekend, I was actually able to say to the guy in Spain, well, actually, pick up the phone to X in Italy, and they will tell you they had the same problem a year ago and how they were able to do that. And that was not through any major, sort of silver bullet I had. It was literally just by getting on a plane and traveling around all of Europe and listening to, their journeys they were going in and understanding how the strategy was going to impact them or what changes they would need to tweak to the strategy. And then, because we have this problem. And then I'm finding out, a little bit, we've got problem, the same problem. And it's like, we just can't get a handle on it. And I go, well, actually, almost certainly the problems have been faced before, and actually it has. And here's how you go about doing it. So I hate silos.
Yeah. And it's actually, when I look, because obviously I would have looked back through your various roles that you've had right up to CEO roles, what you're describing there in a lot of ways is, I suppose, what we would envisage a really effective CEO being able to do in ways where what you're trying to do is essentially create an atmosphere and an environment within the organization where people are cross-collaborating, and you're the one breaking down those silos. You're the one, let's say, you mentioned obviously the sacred cows, but trying to shift the mentality, the mindset of the organization, and constantly thinking about, innovation, creativity. That has to come, because obviously you do have the examples of CEOs who go in and they just carry on doing what was done before them, and they might be relatively successful. Let's say they might be risk averse. Okay, why would I change it? It's always kind of gone okay. I'll just do what I saw has gone before me. Whereas it seems like you very much, when you go in, whether it's the GloHealth or wherever it might be, you've got that natural, let's say, entrepreneurial mindset to look at it and say, actually, can we tweak it? Can we do it a little bit better than it's being done at the moment?
Yeah, sometimes. I think when I look at a role as CEO, I think the kind of easiest sort of analogy is the conductor of the orchestra. So is like what I was saying about GloHealth, but it was the exact same in WebDoctor or whatever. I'm the CEO. I wasn't the CEO in GloHealth, but of my team, we'll call it, in GloHealth, and in WebDoctor, I was CEO. I know enough about music to know when we're in tune. I know how to read music sheet and make sure everyone's on time, but I'm not as good a violinist as the head violinist. I'm not a good drummer as the percussionist, or, all the different things. So, and that doesn't bother me in the sense of from an ego or whatever perspective. And in fact, it's the opposite. I love working with people who are really top of their game and way better at whatever it is than I am. And I'm kind of constantly learning. So my job isn't to play the violin or to bang the drums or whatever it is, the trumpets. And my job is to, this is when we start. This is when the crescendo, this is, I don't know enough about orchestras to know all the sounds of it, but do you know what I mean? And keeping it's sort of in tune, and I have enough of an ear to know, well, that violin is out of tune, so need to, work with that person to tune it up, etc. So it's kind of bringing us, and setting that vision and that North Star, so that the sheet of music is kind of the North Star that, I may have written it, or I may have written bits of it that, it's been collaborating, but whoever's written it, this is now our strategy and this is where we're going forward.
Yeah.
And we're kind of all playing that same tune. And that's kind of how I see sort of my role as CEO if I'm in that position.
And talk to me a bit about stepping into that role for the first time. Because obviously you'd had a number of senior leadership roles throughout your career.
Yeah.
What was it like for you stepping into that role for the first time? Was there a level of self-doubt, imposter syndrome? Was there a voice in the head saying, God, will I be able to do this?
Well, I sort of been managing director of the stem cell business, but that was relatively small. I think the biggest we got it up to was maybe 4 or 5 employees. So I was sort of head honcho, but it was nothing like when I became, for example, CEO of WebDoctor. Because when I became CEO of WebDoctor, I think there might have been 60 employees. You were turning over about 2.25 million. It had been set up by basically 4 founders, 3 guys who were on software engineers and 1 GP, and Oisin, who was, like, I don't think I'm being disrespectful to the other founders, but he was really the driving force of the company. He was and is like the smartest software engineer I've ever come across. He was, he could solve a problem in minutes that other engineers could never solve. So I was coming into a very sort of long-established business with very long-established ways of doing things, and we were in a position where we had a good product. We had sort of 2 products, which I'm happy to go into if you want in a minute. But we had a board as well that was full of really, really seasoned, experienced business people. I'm sorry to say all businessmen, which was definitely an issue that we had. But and so there was a huge amount that I could learn, but it was very, very intense. And so we knew we needed funding, effectively keep the show on the road. Yeah. The company had, the board who set the strategy. And sometimes people forget a CEO is not always the person who necessarily sets the strategy. He executes the strategy. But the strategy is coming from the board, the shareholders, of which the CEO may or may not be kind of a member of. But anyway, setting the strategy was we were going to pump a lot of money into R&D. So we knew we would be loss-making. And that was fine if we had the euros in the bank to fund that. But obviously, if we didn't have the euros in the bank, that could have been catastrophic. So it was a kind of an intense period for everybody. And you come into every company I've come into, whether I've come in at a very junior level or a middle level or obviously in a senior level, like no company's perfect. So no matter which company it is, there's always areas where we could do things better. Where WebDoctor / Medihive had a phenomenal sort of IP was in those founders. And as I said, in particular in sort of the way Oisin could conceptualize software, etc. But there were other issues that we had. So did I have imposter syndrome? I mean, I think I probably have that all the time, as in, I think it's sort of a natural sort of thing you have. And I don't mind living with it because I feel it keeps me on my toes. Okay, I'm never complacent. So yeah, I definitely had that going in. And so, yeah, I can't code. So like if I'm going in and having to sit in the board and have a conversation where Oisin's talking about coding, like I'm going to be lost. I might as well be talking about, brain surgery or something. Yeah. But I never felt, whatever about other people, I never felt that was my job. And I used to use an example of like Michael O'Leary. He can't fly a plane. He's the most successful CEO probably Ireland's ever had. So it doesn't mean that you have to be the code.
Finance background.
Yeah, finance background. Yeah. And horse background, actually. Yeah. I think his dad was a cattle trader. So, commercial background, etc. So I kind of felt that despite the fact I couldn't code, etc., that wasn't what they needed me for. We had an amazing coding team led by a guy who was at the top of that game. So it was other stuff. And so there were issues that needed to be solved. And you could see them and they would say, well, that's where I'll draw my attention.
So they had the technical expertise. So then what was those areas that you zoned in on and focused? Because I know that we had, in your time as CEO, there was obviously 2 successful investment rounds, obviously, which were
3.
3,
yeah,
right?
Yeah,
which obviously were critically important as you've described.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what were the aspects that you had to focus in on.
Well, that was definitely one. So myself and the CFO, a guy called Richard, who was a phenomenal guy, absolutely adore Richard, very good friends since. He and me had to kind of go on that sort of milk round or whatever it's called, to try and get funds. Now we were we were fortunate in that obviously we had a board. Some of them had, connections, etc. And, so we weren't kind of completely going out into the dark. But yet we still had to be able to tell a story, which is really important. And then we also had to, we might tell the story to the key guy who was going to put the money in, but then he'd actually step away and he'd put his experts, whether they were legal experts, accounting experts, to say, right, get under the bonnet of this car and check and see the engine's okay, etc. So that became very granular. And you need to be able to absolutely stand over everything that you're saying. So that took up absolutely a good bit of my time. But then on the commercial side, as I said, the engineers had built product, but probably where we might have struggled is the product was usually kind of almost built bespokely for our clients. And therefore, it made it very difficult to scale that because, if we built the product for Mark and then we wanted to sell it to Mary, you couldn't really have Mark's product. And what we needed to do was kind of build a sort of a core product for you with modules, etc., around it that you could kind of tailor to what specifically you needed. But broadly speaking, it was, a core product that we could then go and sell to Mary. So that required a mindset shift. And, that was something that we had to kind of bring some people on a journey with. And, I think sometimes all these are cliche, but I often feel the cliches are there for a reason. Like engineers, what they're great at is building things, but sometimes you just stop building and just say, we've now got what we need kind of for the next bit. Let's just sweat this asset rather than kind of, always building. And so if you go to an engineer and say, I've got this problem, that's just like manna from heaven from them. Because, oh yeah, I can build you this thing that will solve it. But sometimes actually 90% of it can be solved by what we already had. And let's not kind of rebuild it again. So in terms of trying to change the pricing structure, we kind of, because of how we were building sort of on a, like one-off houses in Ireland, and we built a one-off house and we got really well paid for that. And the guys had set up a really good business doing that. But now we got to find the next one-off house. But what if we could kind of build, I don't know, analogies maybe going around the legs here, but like an apartment block, and then we could sell the first apartment and then we could sell the second apartment. We don't have to keep rebuilding that unit, if you know what I mean. So that was an area that we needed to look at. And then we had some issues around sort of attrition levels. The guys had set the business up way before COVID for kind of very legitimate reasons to be remote, because some of particularly the software talent was either not in Ireland or maybe had been in Ireland, but for different reasons, family reasons, had moved out of Ireland. So they had never really set up a business that had a focal point, as in, a place to hang your hat, etc., which was fine. I didn't necessarily have an issue with that, but it definitely meant that we needed to work really hard on things like the culture, etc., and what it meant to work for the company, and making sure people were aware of what was going on, and felt when they were coming in they were part of a greater purpose. I had read a book at the time, my sister had bought it for me, called Drive by Daniel Pink. Yeah. And there was 3 parts to it. There was mastery, autonomy, and purpose. And we were working in healthcare, so like every day we had a doctor who was helping someone, whether it was with a cold or maybe it was something far more serious. You need to go to an A&E, blah, blah, blah. But the engineers didn't realize, they were away coding, but it was their coding which allowed the doctor to see the person remotely, which meant they were either getting better or maybe something even, worse. We had a couple of instances where Sil, who was the founder, could tell the person at the other end was in serious trouble and called an ambulance, and was trying to get that across to them, like this greater purpose that you're working on. Which is, letting people live their best lives kind of type thing, etc., where it might not have naturally come to them because all they see is, the ones and zeros or whatever it is they're writing when they're doing their coding. But not even just them, the person in finance, the person in HR, etc. The doctors obviously felt that, and the nurses felt that. So that was really important. So there was a lot going on, and again, very like GloHealth, Some people I inherited, some people I recruited into that C-suite team. But what I learned there was, the lessons from GloHealth about my team, I really put into practice. And so I mentioned Richard earlier with Denise. She was amazing in HR, and Ian, who's now gone on to greater things in marketing, and another Richard, sort of in sales, etc. And Olin. We built up, a really, really good team who were brilliant at what they were tasked to do. And we had a good dynamic in the sense of, we kind of had a common North Star, but also there was challenges, which again, I would totally welcome. And I've no problem with someone saying, well, look, David, I think we should go left. If I'm saying we should go right, you talk it through. I mean, ultimately, if you're CEO, you have to make the call if it's left or right, but don't let as I think I mentioned earlier on, the ego kind of, well, we're just going right, that's it, because I certainly do not have a monopoly on wisdom.
No, and you're right. Like, I think what you're describing in a lot of ways in that final point is we talk about psychological safety so much. It's such a buzzword now, but that's what you're describing. As the person, let's say, at the top of the organization, you've got to be really open to inviting challenge and inviting feedback, because then that essentially creates the license for everybody throughout the organization to adopt the same approach. And I like how you talked about, you read the Dan Pink book, because what that also says to me as well is, for anybody listening, business owner, executive, that sometimes just actually, picking up a book, reading it, it's going to give you a different perspective on how you might be managing a certain situation. And that book is so popular, right? But what a lot of people, maybe some know, maybe they don't, there's an original theory of motivation around work, and it's centered around autonomy, competence, and relatedness, right?
Right.
Goes researchers called Dici and Ryan, and it's decades old, right? And obviously it never really got the credit it deserved until Dan.
So he stole their clothes, did he?
Believe it or not, that's a lot more common than you would think.
Right.
Yeah. But what I'd also say as well is, he was obviously looking at, again, random example, bit of a side note, but he was able to market that and make it appeal to people like you. Whereas even though the research was done years before that, it obviously only really became popular when he incorporated it into that book drive.
Yeah. I mean, I find sometimes, I have other books, etc., and not just books, podcasts, or whatever it is. Sometimes when you read the books, like I would have naturally, if I was doing a podcast like this back in the time, like autonomy for me, because I like autonomy. So therefore I kind of live by that sword, I'll die by that sword. So therefore my team, broadly speaking, I'd like to think I give them autonomy because, like I said, they're the violinists or whatever it happens to be. So that kind of, when you read that book, you go, oh yeah, well that's me. But it was kind of like the purpose was the one that I got out of that one that I probably subconsciously maybe had thought about, but I really hadn't sort of verbalized it in my own mind, etc. And then realized that, I'd worked in ResMed, an amazing purpose. GloHealth was the same thing. We were providing, we were paying the claims of people who were ending up in hospital, and without that claim, maybe they might have got, at the time and even now, you're stuck in a really long waiting list to go and see the checkup, etc. So, but I had never really probably articulated it to myself as to what it was. And so now, if I was doing a job interview or something, and I was looking at companies that I go and work for me, the purpose is really important. And that's what I got out of the book. So maybe it was either awaken something that was already there, I just hadn't really thought about, or maybe it wasn't there and I just went, yeah, that resonates.
Yeah. I think we more and more now see the relevance of that, not as something that's just up on the wall, but something then that becomes part of our internal communications. Like literally, how do we make people in this organization feel an attachment towards the purpose? I think that's so important now, because obviously, we're at more or less full employment. There's a talent war out there.
Yeah.
It can't just be based on salary and benefits. So much of it leans towards, okay, does my purpose align with the purpose of this organization? And more importantly, does this organization actually live their purpose, or do they just put it up on LinkedIn for people to see?
Yeah, I know. I mean, look, there's always people who are kind of leading in that, and then there's people who go, oh, he seems to be doing well, I better have a purpose, and and all of a sudden they go into ChatGPT and give me a purpose or something. But But, and I think COVID, and even maybe 10 years earlier, the crash or whatever, but certainly COVID probably reset, a lot of people's purpose, because it was such a monumental event globally, etc., that we were all caught up in. And, so for Gen Zs or millennials, etc., purpose, I think, is very important to them. But the other two are important as well. And, so you got to remember that it's, 10, 15 years ago, it was one, and now maybe it's purpose, but it shouldn't be purpose at the expense of, of some of the things. I'm not talking about the money and stuff, but, that mastery, I have found that, like, again, in WebDoctor, one of the issues that we had was, and again, it wasn't done sort of maliciously, but there wasn't maybe necessarily career paths sort of put out, articulated for someone. So you came in to do a job, but like, yeah, okay, I've done that now for a year. I'm doing really well in that, but what's the next thing for me? And because they had mastered that initial one. And so that was one of the things, say, for example, myself and Denise, who was the HR director, trying to do, so you could go in, because as I said, we had maybe attrition levels and we wanted to stop that. So we wanted to be able to say, you come in here and then you go to there, et cetera, et cetera.
And it's so important that people have that pathway. And then it obviously acts, as you say, and we've described, it acts as such a motivator for them. Okay, I'm here right now, and here's what I need to do to get to there. And it's never left to chance, as in, I'm not going to be stagnant. I'm not going to be stuck here for the next 5 years.
Yeah.
There is that.
I mean, look, it's really important for the person, but even if you don't care about the person, it's so important for the company, because basically what companies sometimes forget is, particularly the junior people, you're the person who's put all the money into kind of getting them their skills, etc. And if then they walk out the door, you now have to replace them. But B, you've lost all of that. So that cost has now walked out the door with them. So even if you are just this hard-nosed, I don't really care about, but I care about the dollars coming into the company and out of the company.
It's worth the upfront time investment. Yeah.
And give them a reason to stay beyond the year or 2 years or whatever it is that they were sort of leaving before that.
So I have two final questions for you,
Right.
David. The first one, and what's really interesting about this, is our next guest is going to be essentially as a professor in entrepreneurship, right?
Right.
But one thing we didn't mention, and we're going to bring you all the way back now, but your dad and your granddad were actually entrepreneurs. They a printing business.
Yep.
Talk to me a little bit about, because there's a lot of research around entrepreneurial families.
Right.
And how if the dad or the mom was an entrepreneur, the kids generally are more prone to go into running their own business. What type of impact did, I suppose, you seeing that, and I imagine working in that, what was the impact for you long term?
So I can't talk too much about my granddad. He died when I was pretty young, but they were from Kerry, and he had worked in the Kerry Man, which is the newspaper down there, and he left sort of, I think, in the 50s, early 50s maybe, to come up to Dublin. So he took a big risk, because it was a solid job, and they were, back then probably, you probably either stayed in Kerry or you actually went to America or England. But, anyway, they came up, and my dad joined the business that he was in. It wasn't the granddad's business, but the business he was in, and he was a sales guy. And I don't know the full story, but basically there was a big falling out, we'll call it, between my dad and the business, and a couple of other people. So my dad was the sort of sales guy in the original business, and he took the main printer, and then back then they used to have a guy who made the plates, which was literally what they'd stick on the printing machines to print the paper. The three of them all up sticks and set up their own company out in Phibsborough. So that was probably mid-70s, just kind of when I was, maybe 3 or 4. So my earliest memories were, it was very tough. But he was kind of a really strong salesperson and really good, at relationships and that kind of thing. And he leveraged some of those relationships to get the business up and running. And then as an entrepreneur, he could have 1 year and it was amazing, and then another year it would be, not as amazing. And I know, talking to him in later years, there was a couple of years where it was touch and go. Would they see it through, and would they go bust and all that kind of stuff? And you're thinking like the 70s and 80s recessions in Ireland, so very, very tough. But But I used to go in. So when I was maybe about 9 or 10, I used to love it. I used to go in for 2 weeks in the summer holidays, and I would be, because they were printing, they were making, I'm trying to think, like a diary. So they'd print a diary, and then they would have the little covers. And all my job, you had to stick the diary into the cover, and you have to do like hundreds of thousands of them. But and then at the end of the week, I think initially my payday was at McDonald's. But then eventually, I think, I can't remember, when I was maybe 14, 15, it was like £20 or something, which was amazing. But what things I kind of learned from was the resilience. So you need really resilience in that period to be an entrepreneur or to be a business owner. But also kind of, the relationships that he built. So I'd say, he passed away a couple of years ago, and he worked right up pretty much until he died. Like the clients he had from the 70s were the clients he still had when he passed away in sort of 2016 or so. He had kept, and a couple of those clients, he had one, say one of the really big insurance companies. Like every now and then, he'd tell me, "Oh, we've lost that company because they got a new print manager in, and they wanted to go to a bigger company, or they had these bigger." And they always came back because of the quality of the work, etc. And he kind of knew their business, their print business, better than the guys internally would know. And there was a couple of unions that he worked with, the teacher side, the INTO, and he had them, 40 years, client for 40 years. So he also showed about how to, you treat your client, and it wasn't it was the long game. It wasn't the,
one sale and then move on to the next, and the client retention aspect was
exactly.
Was
and I've learned that myself, to be honest. But if you're putting clients in at the top and they're just coming out the bottom, eventually it'll just stop. It just can't happen. You have to hold on as best you can. And each industry is different because life cycles and clients, some are very transactional, it's commodity driven, but broadly speaking, you need to try and hold on to your clients. So I kind of learned about that, the resilience, how he treated the customers. One thing I also learned was he was absolutely brutal on technology. I mean, even right up until the end, like, he didn't do anything by email. He didn't have a mobile phone. He still used the fax machine, was the height of technology. So they were saying like, geez, come on. He had a mobile phone maybe in the last 2 years, I'd say. But that was like 2010 or 11, he was getting a mobile phone. But he had just got through, like he would tell, my auntie was his secretary, and they like maybe 15 people in the company. And he'd just say, right, I'm going off to visit this client. So if you need me, ring them. So when you get there, go, oh, Teresa's left a message for you, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I'd be a big technology, into my technology. So I also learned how technology maybe could have helped him a little bit.
Excellent. Excellent. Oh no, that's really good and nice to hear as well. Last question, David. We ask every guest this question, so we want to leave we want you to leave us with a nice bit of wisdom. You've left us with a lot already, but if you were to kind of sum up one, I always kind of phrase this as a lesson that you've learned throughout your career that you'd like to pass on to somebody else. What would that be?
All right, yeah, thanks for that. Looking for some profound kind of answer. Well, maybe a segue from the previous answer, and it sort of is a genuine thing. It's not just because I said it about my dad. I think, look, there's loads of lessons, but one that maybe I would say is kind of been with me right from the start is the importance of cultivating your network, and cultivating that network in a way, not just, oh, I'm in a bit of trouble, who can I reach out to help me? You know what I mean? It's got to be a two-way street. So, and like, I've spoken before about to people about, I'm only young, I don't have that work. I say, you absolutely do. If you're in business, even if you're just straight in, you've got your primary school network, your secondary school network. You might have went to your university, your friends, your family. You can build that network. From the age of whatever, 18, if you're going into business. And it's got to be a two-way street. So when I mean that, it's not like, oh, Mark, I've done you a favor today, so now you owe me a favor tomorrow. Yeah. It could be I do you a favor, but then, Mark, you're doing a favor for someone else, and that person's doing a favor for someone else, etc. So it's built on a sort of from this place of generosity and genuineness, etc. And while the person I did the favor for, or I'm there for them in their network, may not be the person that, if you open yourself up kind of to that sort of reciprocity, I find it does come. So I've reached out to people I was in, say, secondary school, which I hadn't seen since secondary school in 25 years, but I saw on LinkedIn they worked for X, and maybe I was trying to get in there or whatever. And in my experience, I don't think anyone's ever told me to F off or whatever.
Yeah.
They've all, may or may not have been able to help me or whatever, but they've never had an issue with me reaching out. And then in some of those cases, actually reconnected with the guy I was in school with, and, then it becomes a different kind of relationship as well. So I'm sure it seems pretty obvious, but I suppose it's cultivating the network in a way that's open and, generous and not done with an expectation of a payback.
Yeah.
But ironically, the payback then does come.
No, and we're kind of finishing the way we started as well, because obviously, you did that for me quite early in my business where you were.
So you do owe me. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's funny? I know an individual that we both know extremely well, Alan Foy, obviously.
Yeah.
And I remember Alan was very good to me in the early years of my business with advice. And I always remember thinking, God, Alan, can I pay you, or can I do something for this great advice you're giving me? And he always used to just say to me, just when somebody is in your shoes in the future, don't say no.
Yeah.
Say yes.
I sent an email to Alan yesterday on a business I'm trying to set up to get his advice and insights. Yeah, he's a great guy, and he was the director, he was one of the investors into WebDoctor when I was CEO of WebDoctor. He actually led the final round as well. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
David Crimmins, thank you very much for joining me on the Lead Well podcast.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.